It happened live, on camera, in front of thousands of people who had come to church that Sunday morning expecting a sermon, not a scare. In November 2024, Bishop T.D. Jakes was preaching at the Potter's House in Dallas when he suffered a massive heart attack, right there on the platform, in full view of his congregation and the cameras that stream his services around the world. For a few terrifying minutes, one of the most powerful voices in American Christianity looked like he might not make it. And in the months that followed, a question started circulating that nobody wanted to say out loud, but everybody was thinking, what happens to the Potter's House when T.D. Jakes is gone? Nobody expected the answer to arrive so fast. By the summer of 2025, Jakes had done something almost unheard of in the world of megachurch leadership. He didn't wait to be forced out. He didn't cling to the pulpit until his body made the decision for him. He stood in front of his 30,000-member congregation, and he handed over the keys on his own terms while he was still standing. This is the story of how a heart attack on live television reshaped the future of one of the largest churches in America, and what it says about power, succession, and legacy in the modern megachurch era. To understand how big a moment this was, you have to understand who T.D. Jakes actually is, because this isn't just some regional pastor stepping down from a mid-sized congregation. Thomas Dexter Jakes was born on June 9, 1957, in South Charleston, West Virginia, the youngest of 3 children. His father ran a janitorial business, his mother was a school teacher, and by all accounts, young Jakes grew up in a household that valued hard work and faith above almost everything else. He started preaching small sermons as a teenager, and in 1979, at just 22 years old, he founded his first church, a tiny storefront congregation in Montgomery, West Virginia, with about 10 members, 10 people. That's where the empire began. Over the next decade and a half, Jakes built and rebuilt congregations across West Virginia, moving from Montgomery to Smithers, then to South Charleston, where his flock grew to around 300 people, and then to Cross Lanes, where it exploded past 1,100 members, a mixed congregation that was roughly 60% Black and 40% white, which was itself notable in a region and era where churches were rarely that integrated. Along the way, Jakes started branching into publishing and broadcasting, founding TDJ Enterprises in 1995 to produce his books and later his films, and hosting a syndicated radio and television program called Get Ready that gave him a national platform before he ever had a national church. Then, in 1996, everything changed. Jakes packed up his ministry, his wife, his kids, and around 50 members of his congregation, and moved to Dallas, Texas, where he purchased a large church campus from a disgraced televangelist who had gone to prison for tax evasion. That property became the Potter's House. What started as a relocation turned into one of the fastest-growing religious institutions in American history. By 1998, just 2 years after opening its doors, the Potter's House had already surpassed 14,000 members. Today, it sits on nearly 30 acres in Dallas, with a main sanctuary that seats more than 8,000 people. And the broader Potter's House network includes campuses in Fort Worth, North Dallas, and even a location in Los Angeles called One LA. The membership figure most commonly cited today is over 30,000 people, which puts it firmly in the upper tier of American megachurches, comparable to institutions like Lakewood Church in Houston or Joel Osteen's Operation, both in scale and in cultural influence. And Jakes didn't stop at the church walls. He became a publishing phenomenon, authoring dozens of best-selling books, including Woman Thou Art Loosed, which became a cultural touchstone for Black women navigating trauma and healing, and he moved into film, producing and appearing in movies, winning industry recognition along the way, including a Grammy Award for one of his spoken word recordings. His business arm, now organized under something called the T.D. Jakes Group, spans real estate ventures, media production, and a nonprofit foundation. Estimates of his personal net worth vary depending on the source, with figures ranging anywhere from $20 million to $50 million, and reporting from Black Enterprise once put the total revenue generated by his media enterprises over 2 decades at roughly $400 million. Whatever the exact number, the picture is clear. T.D. Jakes didn't just build a church. He built a media and ministry conglomerate with a footprint most Fortune 500 marketing departments would envy, which is exactly why the events of November 2024 hit so hard. Jakes was in the middle of delivering a sermon, doing what he had done nearly every Sunday for almost 50 years, when he suffered a massive heart attack in front of his live congregation and the cameras broadcasting the service. It was captured on video, and clips of the moment spread rapidly, sparking real fear among his followers about whether the 67-year-old bishop would survive, let alone return to the pulpit. He underwent heart surgery the same day, and in a detail that later became one of the more striking parts of his public recovery story, Jakes revealed he was fully conscious during the procedure. Months later, appearing on the Today Show in March 2025, Jakes opened up about the experience in strikingly personal terms, describing an almost otherworldly sense of calm during the crisis, saying he found himself in a quiet, peaceful, serene space, and describing the whole ordeal as a privilege to glimpse what might lie on the other side. He called himself a miracle. And for a man who had spent nearly 5 decades preaching about faith, mortality, and purpose, surviving a heart attack in front of his own congregation seems to have forced a kind of reckoning that no sermon could have prepared him for. Because here's the thing about succession in megachurches, it almost never goes smoothly. Look around the landscape of American Christianity, and you'll find story after story of charismatic founder pastors who built massive followings around their own personality, and then either refused to step aside or waited so long that when they finally did, the transition triggered lawsuits, congregational splits, and in some cases, the total collapse of the institution. Church succession experts have pointed out for years that the biggest risk factor for a megachurch isn't finances or scandal, it's the founder's ego, the inability to imagine the ministry continuing without them at the center of it. Jakes, by contrast, appears to have spent years quietly preparing for this exact moment, long before his heart attack forced the timeline into motion. In 2022, his daughter Sarah Jakes Roberts and her husband Touré Roberts relocated from Los Angeles to Dallas, and in 2023, they were formally installed as assistant pastors at the Potter's House, a role that gave them 2 full years of hands-on experience inside the ministry before anyone was talking publicly about a handoff. That's not the behavior of a man improvising after a health scare. That's the behavior of a man executing a plan that had already been in motion. The public turning point came on April 27, 2025, when Jakes stood in front of his congregation and announced he would be stepping back as senior pastor, with his daughter and son-in-law set to take over the role later that year. He spent roughly 30 minutes outlining the transition, and by most accounts in the room, he was visibly emotional, choking back tears as he explained what it meant to hand over an institution he had built from nothing over almost 3 decades. He was careful, though, to frame the moment not as a retirement, but as something closer to a rebirth. In his own words at the time, he described the moment as not a departure, but a rebirth, insisting he would never stop preaching and would continue to minister in some capacity. He talked about being in his 50th year in the public spotlight and said that at this stage of his life and career, he wanted to turn some of his attention toward larger societal issues, specifically naming his concern about the shrinking middle class, ongoing social unrest, and what he called closing opportunity gaps in American life. It was a notable pivot for a man best known for stadium-sized sermons and self-help bestsellers, suggesting his post-pulpit chapter might look more like public advocacy and policy-adjacent work than quiet retirement. Then, on July 6, 2025, during a service marking the Potter's House's 29th anniversary, the transition became official. In a ceremony that reportedly ran nearly 4 hours and was described by the church as a historic moment of leadership transition, Jakes formally installed Sarah Jakes Roberts and Touré Roberts as co-senior pastors. The room, by all accounts, erupted, with a long-standing ovation as Jakes presented the couple to the congregation he had shepherded for almost 30 years. He reportedly embraced them with a blessing pulled from the book of Romans, and the tone throughout was less like a corporate handoff and more like a family passing down something sacred. Touré Roberts, who is 51, is not new to ministry leadership himself. He's the founder of One Church, now branded under the Potter's House umbrella as a Potter's House Church, which he built in Los Angeles before relocating to Dallas. And Sarah Jakes Roberts, who is 36, has built her own substantial platform completely independent of her father's shadow. She's the founder of Women Evolve, a ministry and conference brand aimed largely at women, and she's built a public persona around radical honesty about her own life, including becoming a teenage mother and later going through a divorce, experiences she's used repeatedly in her teaching and writing rather than hiding from them. In other words, this wasn't a case of a legacy pastor installing his kids purely because of bloodline. Both incoming co-senior pastors arrived with their own ministries, their own followings, and their own track records already built before they ever took the stage at Potter's House. So, what actually happens now? Practically speaking, Jakes has not disappeared. He's retained the role of chairman of the board and what the church describes as spiritual overseer, a position that keeps him connected to governance and long-term vision without requiring him to run weekly operations or preach every Sunday. He also continues to chair the T.D. Jakes Foundation and the broader T.D. Jakes Group, meaning his business and philanthropic interests remain fully intact even as his day-to-day pastoral duties wind down. Meanwhile, Sarah and Touré have signaled that their leadership era is going to look noticeably different from his. Multiple reports describe their vision centering on modernization and a broader approach to community outreach, an effort to keep the Potter's House relevant to younger generations who may not respond to the same style of ministry that built the church in the first place. That's not a small challenge. Megachurches across the country have struggled with generational handoffs precisely because the founder's personal charisma is often inseparable from the brand itself. And audiences that grew up on live-stream sermons and short-form content expect something different from church than the audiences of the 1990s and 2000s did. Sarah Jakes Roberts, in particular, already has a built-in advantage here. Her Women Evolve platform has cultivated an audience that skews younger and more digitally native than a traditional Sunday congregation, which could give the Potter's House a real bridge into demographics that have historically been the hardest for legacy megachurches to retain. There's also a broader story here about what succession says about an institution's health. When Jakes addressed his congregation, He said something that cuts right to the anxiety underlying this entire transition, essentially telling them that after everything that happened in November, he couldn't risk something happening to him and leaving them without a shepherd. That's a remarkably candid thing for a leader of his stature to admit publicly, that his own mortality was now an operational risk to an institution with thousands of employees, hundreds of thousands of members and viewers globally, and a media and business empire attached to it. Most founder-led organizations, religious or secular, avoid saying the quiet part out loud like that. Jake's didn't. And by acting decisively rather than letting speculation and uncertainty fester for years, he arguably protected the very legacy he spent almost 50 years building. Compare that to other high-profile ministry transitions that have played out messily in public, with lawsuits over control of assets, family members fighting over pulpits, and congregations splintering because no clear plan existed. The Potter's House, at least so far, looks like it avoided that fate almost entirely, and did so specifically because the plan was put in motion years before it was actually needed. None of this means the road ahead is guaranteed to be smooth. Co-pastoring a congregation of 30,000 people spread across multiple campuses, with a media operation, conferences, and a business empire attached, is an enormous undertaking for any two people, no matter how prepared they are. Sarah Jakes Roberts and Touré Roberts will inevitably be compared to Jakes for years, possibly decades. And every decision they make, from sermon style to financial priorities to how the church engages with hot-button social and political issues, will be measured against the shadow of the man who built the place. There's also the question of how the broader Potter's House network across Dallas, Fort Worth, and Los Angeles evolves under joint leadership rather than a singular voice at the top, something the institution has never really had to navigate at this scale before. And there's the matter of Jakes himself. He said publicly that this is not a retirement, that he intends to keep preaching and keep working, just with a different focus. How that plays out in practice, whether he stays meaningfully involved or gradually recedes from public view as his health and age dictate, will shape how smooth this transition actually looks in 5 or 10 years, not just in the emotional glow of one 4-hour installation service. What makes this story worth paying attention to, beyond the specifics of one church in Dallas, is what it represents. American megachurches are, in many cases, entering a generational reckoning right now. The pastors who built the biggest platforms of the late 20th century, the ones who turned regional ministries into media empires through television, publishing, and eventually social platforms, are aging and, in some cases, like Jake's, facing serious health crises that force the succession question whether they're ready or not. How each of these institutions handles that moment, whether with a carefully engineered handoff like the one at the Potter's House, or with the chaos and infighting that has plagued other prominent ministries, will determine which of these churches survive as lasting institutions and which quietly shrink into irrelevance once the founder is gone. T.D. Jakes, by nearly every account of how this played out, chose the harder, more disciplined path. He built the succession plan years in advance. He brought his successors into the organization long before announcing anything publicly. And when his own body forced the timeline forward, he had the infrastructure ready to move fast instead of scrambling. Whether that becomes the model other megachurches follow, or remains an exception in a landscape full of cautionary tales, is something we'll be watching play out for years to come. For now, the Potter's House has a new era, a new generation at the pulpit, and a founder who, by his own words, isn't gone, just repositioned, still preaching, still building, just no longer standing alone at the center of it all. If you found this breakdown useful, let us know in the comments what you think this means for the future of megachurches in America, and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories shaping faith, culture, and power today.